Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Thunderstock Show, a collection of valuable brainstorms to enhance your life, liberty, and pursuit of property. I'm your host, Ross Stockdale, Fractional Chief Marketing Officer and owner of Thunderstock Marketing. Today's special guest is John Goehring. John is a former and still radio personality. He's been telling stories for a living since college. He's a business owner, a college professor, and he loves to create content for small businesses. John, thanks for coming on the show today. Love talking to somebody who's also another audio technophile. Tell me a little bit about how you got started in this whole space and what was it like before you went to college? Did you know that you wanted to do this?
Well, thanks so much for having me on, Ross. And the Thunderstock show is a lot of fun to listen to. So I appreciate being a guest on your show. Yeah, audio people, we connected right away on that, and that's my setup is very important to me, and I really want to make sure I got solid audio because that's kind of my brand, right? If I don't have audio, what do I have? I certainly don't have the beauty for the camera here. So they say a face for radio, right? But no, before college, I would say what I wanted to go into was journalism. I wrote for the high school paper. I was that kid, you know. I wanted to be a journalist. I wanted to expose all the lies and all the crap that's in the media and everything. I wanted to expose it. I wanted to be that kind of investigative reporter. Then I got to college and I realized it's not all what it's made out to be, and that the media industry is much more complex. And I just happened to stumble across a college radio station one day and went in there actually first semester of college, and they needed a football play-by-play announcer, and I just dove right in and did something I'd never done before but always wanted to do, and did that for a semester and realized that it's a lot of travel, it's a lot of nights, it's a lot of weekends. Maybe I just want to produce commercials and get into the music side of radio. So that's what I did, and from there, obviously, as we talked before, my story kind of took some twists and turns as far as going into full-time radio, then getting out of full-time radio now to do my own thing. But the constant throughout is I love to tell stories through audio, and I think audio is a powerful yet still underused platform, and this podcast, I think, is proof of that.
Man, play-by-play football announcer. That's an interesting gig. I haven't talked to anyone that's done that.
Yeah.
What was that? Tell me a little bit about your first time doing play-by-play. Was it scary or was it kind of easy because you're a fan?
Oh, it's terrifying at first, but yeah, I tell you, the build up to the first game, I still remember I was sweating bullets. I was, I was shaking. I was all those pre-game jitters that you probably get on the field. I was getting up there in the booth too. The crowd is filing in. We're there setting up a few hours before the game, and but as soon as that mic, that board operator in my ear said, "John, you're on." And I started with my open that I had practiced way too many times because I was so obsessed with, getting it right. As soon as that happened, I realized that I had fallen in love with it. Like seriously, 10 to 15 seconds into starting my broadcasting career, so to speak, I was like, oh my God, this is what I want to do. And obviously took some twists and turns there. I'm not currently a football play-by-play announcer, but it's amazing how the nerves just melted away. I think they say that too, right? Like in football games, like on the field, there's all these nerves, but as soon as that first hit is made, like boom, there you go. As soon as that first question is asked in a podcast interview, boom, you're right into it. I don't know what that is, Ross, but that definitely happened to me too in that experience.
I played football for 8 seasons growing up through elementary school through high school. And I can't relate to the idea that the nerves for football were so much. I was always so excited and it felt like as soon as the first whistle blew that the game started, it was like a snap of the fingers until it was over. It was like, man,
Yeah.
that went by fast. But I will tell you my brief stint in regional mixed martial arts, so
Wow.
amateur cage fighting, the nerves for 6 to 8 weeks before, and then the day of, and then the weigh-ins and all the media were insane. Like, and it wasn't like it was a huge show. I think the most people in attendance were like 2 or 3 thousand people.
Still something.
But as soon as the door behind you clicks and closes, you're like, oh, this is fine. And that feeling is something you want to chase. Now I don't want to get hit anymore. I'm too old for that. But you made a very astute observation that podcasting is sort of the same way,
Mm,
which is which is probably one of the reasons people like you and I like to do it because you're performing, you're on stage, you're on air. Even if only 20 people listen to your interview, and still you don't know who they are, you don't know who's going to find it. It's out in the world, out in the ether. So, how do you how do you chase that feeling today? Like what are some of the things that get you excited that get the nerves ramped up?
man, that's a good question. Well, I still play a lot of tennis. I played tennis through high school and at the club level in college, and that's something that even though I'm not necessarily performing in front of someone or anyone, or if I'm performing in front of 10 people who are sitting at the park watching because because we're good tennis players, so it's like, oh wow, hey, they actually seem to know how to play. I'm definitely no professional, but I certainly can keep the ball in play, and that can be a high for me, which sounds a little silly because our radio station here has thousands of listeners on it, listening at any one given time. And so when I'm on the air, I'm talking to all those people. Yet that just doesn't give me the same rush. Maybe because I do it every
Interesting.
day. It's weird. But like when I'm actually in person performing in front of somebody, like with a sport or getting to speak on stage at an event, I've done some of that too. Those types of things really fire me up. So I kind of seek those opportunities, which feel more few and far between. But for whatever reason, I've gotten like really comfortable and almost now take for granted the on-air personality side of my work, and I probably shouldn't do that. I really probably should really cherish that, and because it is, like you say, it's a performance. But something about not being able to see my audience for me is just makes it more difficult, I guess. I don't know. Has that been your experience too?
It's hilarious that you mentioned that. It's such a true thing. So to answer your question, I did a video sales letter production for a client a week ago. And that client, like me, was also a high level athlete, still competes, wins golf tournaments at the amateur level, could have been pro, but he's a business owner. So we were doing a VSL, just he and I, the camera, the lights, and it probably took us 30 minutes for us to get something that was worth recording out of him. It was very flat. It's hard to get motivated. So it's crazy because I've seen him at live events and he's the life of the party. He's incredibly animated and just like, super on stage. It's really hard for people that are traditional extroverts or that are used to that thrill of being on stage or in person, these events, to replicate that behind the scenes, which is what I think makes doing what we do, one, rewarding because you have to try and bottle that energy, but
Mm,
two, difficult because it's harder to do it in a seemingly vacuum.
yeah.
So the way that I kind of coached him, and I've been coached in other similar scenarios, is act like you're talking to me. Like act like the audience is there. Think of this camera as like a keyhole to a much larger audience. And that's been a pretty helpful frame to try and get fired up and bring that life into communicating to the public that you can't quite see.
Oh, that's interesting that you say that. I like that. Actually, in the radio stations, they have like mannequins of the ideal listener profile, like sitting on. It's kind of creepy and weird, but like at the same time, it achieves that same like. Imagine you're talking to this person. Here's actually a mannequin of your 25-year-old whatever ideal audience member. So I do resonate with that. I like that reframe of a mindset there.
So interesting. Well, they're right. That's just
Yeah.
another step forward. So, John, you're also a college professor. Can you talk a little bit about that? How that happened?
Yeah, well, I there's a local school here who reached out to me actually the department head of the department that I now teach in is also a Newhouse grad at Syracuse, and so she connected with me, and they were looking for an adjunct professor and looking for somebody to teach a course, and she thought I might be a good fit for that, and I thought, how in the world did you think I was a good fit for that? But okay, I'll give it a try. I've never taught in my life, but I've gotten this chance to teach now several semesters, and Really enjoyed it, actually, like more than I thought I would. At first, I thought, okay, I'll try it, see, I'll step outside of my comfort zone. I feel like if you don't step outside of your comfort zone, are you really growing? So that's what I decided to do. And then I realized, you know what? I'm actually kind of enjoying this. I find myself speaking with students after class about the topics we talk about in class. We usually talk about media literacy and, how to spot an ad versus an organic social media post, things like that. Kind of basic stuff. It's actually a gen ed requirement for the college in media literacy. But it's just funny because I find myself talking and I look up at the clock. It's like an hour later, and I'm like, oh wow, I'm still just talking to these kids after class, and they really enjoy it. And it's a different type of public speaking, so it's not something that I was used to. And I still, if you ask me to evaluate myself, I don't think I'm good at it. I really don't think I'm any good at it. But at the same time, I enjoy it, and the students have gotten value from it. I believe they've said they have, and it's just not a traditional type of classroom because I'm not in any way a traditional teacher. But it's a good experience to step out of my comfort zone and do that.
You said two things that really stand out. Number one, because it's not comfortable, you feel like it's an opportunity for growth. 100% agree.
Yeah.
I think that if you're always comfortable doing what you're doing, then you're just repeating that same year. Like you're not getting, if someone has been doing a job for 3 years and they've mastered it and they can do it in their sleep and, they know it like the back of their hand and they do that job for 17 more years, I still look at that as like 3 years of progressive experience because then you just repeated the third year 17 times.
Right. Good point.
Maybe controversial take. The other thing that you mentioned was you don't feel like you're good at it. I think that a trap that people get into is when they think that they're excellent or they've arrived, or they're good, and then they stop like progressing or getting better. That answer depends on your definition of what good looks like. So some of the best performers that I've talked to that are 65-year-old entrepreneurs, business owners, I look at them as mentors and they look at me as peers and they say, well, depends what you're trying to say. I have a bunch of stories to tell. I've got more failures than wins, just so happens my wins stand out. But one of the commonalities between people that I respect highly is that they're not satisfied with their past performance. They're trying to make their next performance better. So is that how you kind of evaluate both business and being a professor?
Definitely. Because I think that everything's constantly changing too. Like in the world of voiceover, for example, what was a popular trending kind of voice in the 80s and 90s is now washed out, old, and not going to get you hired for any voiceover job. I mean, there were people going on in the 80s and 90s in trying to do a commercial and get hired by their agent to do a car commercial, and they're the ones coming on and screaming 20% off on all Kias and all these models and blah 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 blah, and they're really kind of yelling at you. They're giving this very sing-songy delivery. And a lot of these people, and some of them have become good friends of mine and mentors and colleagues, and but some of them have also just become so stubborn in their ways and not wanting to adapt to 2020 and beyond standards, which are just casual conversational. You don't read an ad like you're making a sales pitch. You read an ad like a real person. And
Mm.
I just think that's an interesting point that you made about growth because yes, it's for one thing, like you said, growth and getting better so that you don't live that same year of your life over and over again, Groundhog's Day, right? I totally agree with that. But on the other hand, it's also so that you don't get stuck in a trap of what worked 10, 20, 30 years ago because it doesn't always work now. And voiceover is a good example of that, but I know there's plenty of examples in other industries. Your industry too, Ross. Marketing is probably constantly evolving in the same way. So I just think that's part of growth too, is staying up with what will be more likely to work now.
There's a few elements where if you understand, I'm sort of conflicted. So if you understand people and you understand how you serve people and the desired outcome, I would call it more the meta elements or like the 30,000 foot view. it makes whatever tactic you're deploying easier to learn and understand and get to get a deeper feel for it. But on the other hand, there's marketers that I talk to that are still diehard television commercials. Like, this is the tactic you should be doing, or hey, I'm going to sell you an ad spot in the newspaper. It's going to be great. And it's like, I don't trust that. Like, for as a blanket statement, for some industries, sure, newspaper's great. For some industries, sure, television can really work. But the majority of my clients, it's it's just the ROI is not there. And these salespeople are probably like, oh, why is the industry shrinking? It's like, don't think of it like the industry itself. Like, don't think about like, oh, am I doing a good job? It's thinking like, what is the desired outcome for the listeners, for the users, for the clients? Another perfect example is during the dot-com bubble in the late 90s, early 2000s. I would tell you, local ad agencies, there's probably still a dozen or so that founded in the late 90s, early 2000s. They're doing kind of similar stuff.
Mm.
Like, maybe they've gotten better at the tactics, but they're still doing your website build, they're still doing your SEO, and they're still doing your Google ads. And like, that's all they serve. That's all they do. And then there's other agencies out there that offer AI automations,
Yeah.
totally unrelated to website build or whatever. And there's some that only do social media or whatever. And they're kind of surprised, like, you're going to take market share unless you kind of evaluate and adapt and what works today. So it's an interesting thought. Which leads me to my next question. What are 2 to 3 key milestones in your career or your life path that have kind of helped you to level up or pivot in a different direction?
Well, I would say one of them was getting my master's degree from Syracuse because that was a key moment for me, not only to give myself the confidence that I can go into this own business that I'm starting up, but also to allow me to have some of the network that Syracuse University provided me with because of their vast alumni and having those mentors kind of at access. That has been huge, and I got to say that was number one milestone was actually humbling myself enough to take some business classes at Syracuse because that was key. What I did understand was the voiceover part, was the how to use Adobe Audition and Adobe Premiere and put together content part. That's what I did understand. And it's not that we ever arrive and it's not that can't ever improve, but the place where I was desperately lacking was learning how to start, grow, and
Mm,
continually run a business. So I think my Syracuse degree was one big milestone. And then another milestone for me, I'd say, which came maybe about 2 years ago, was becoming fully self-sufficient in the business, fully sufficient to the point where I didn't have to worry about going back, getting a full-time job
mm.
anywhere. That is a cool feeling. And I know people who enter business usually set themselves higher goals and standards than that. Well, they want all this money, they want employees, they want the big office building, and they want to have the corner office. But for me, I mean, I have the corner office in my house, so that's pretty good. And also, I really that wasn't my goal starting out. My goal was to replace my full-time income, which I did and I've done, and I've been able to sustain now and not have to crunch the numbers and worry about going back to a corporate job. That was a milestone for me.
Look, man, I love hearing that story as much as I love hearing stories people making the Inc. 5000 list, because
Mm,
some people's not everyone has the same motivation. That's what makes humanity a unique thing and fun. But some people want freedom. They don't
yeah.
want to be felt like they're bound to one employer. Or, they don't want to feel like they're shackled to their desk. And then I talk to other entrepreneurs that have these lofty ambitions and goals for growth, but then they become more trapped than when they were just employees. They're like, oh, I wish I
Mm,
could just be an employee and make a steady, stable income and not have to have all these stressors and stuff. So having the balance and the freedom and the self-awareness to be like, hey, this is my goal. And like, when you're always seeking happiness and external satisfaction, you sometimes forget to stop and smell the roses and be like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like,
yeah.
life doesn't suck.
Yeah. That's for sure. Yeah, no, I would 100% agree with that. How do you define success is something I've been thinking about a lot lately because it's like, well, chasing after all these things that the world thinks is success isn't always how I define success. There's some overlap there certainly, but it's not always the way I would define it. And I can't imagine I'm the only one who feels that way. Yet we feel pressured to go after certain things just because it's been told to us that that's what we should want.
How do you define success?
So I define success as having the flexibility and the freedom of choice to, on any given day, do what I want to do and do what brings me joy. So that doesn't mean I don't keep a calendar. It doesn't mean that I can't, you know,
You just play tennis all day.
right, exactly. That's not necessarily success, but at the same time, having the ability to control my own calendar, say yes, say no to things, versus having somebody else. That's how I define professional success. It's not necessarily a dollar value. Of course, there is a dollar value sort of assigned to that because in order to live, in order to be profitable enough to be able to live in the house and be able to put groceries on the table, right? You do need to have a certain amount of income. So as long as that income can be made through something flexible, to me, that's success. And anything on top of that is bonus.
Yeah, when we talk about the word freedom, I love I love defining terms. So, as a person with a philosophy degree, defining
Mm,
the word freedom was a big thing that I studied in school.
interesting.
And traditionally in Western thought, freedom is defined one of two ways. Is number one, absence of external coercion, and number two, which is kind of easier, the ability to do otherwise. So, if you can say no to an opportunity or an event or a task in one sense, that's freedom. Because if you have to do it, everything, if your calendar is set in stone, dictated by somebody else, by my definition, that's not freedom. And that could be, you could even be self employed and not have freedom because, like I said before, you're bound to your desk, or if one client leaves, then you just can't have that outcome. But when you can start saying, "Hey, I don't think this is working out anymore. I'm going to go a different route to a client," and still be able to go the next day and choose your schedule, I think it's a really healthy way to look at freedom in terms of success.
Hmm. That's really interesting. You mentioned not being bound by external coercion. Is that right? Or not being influenced by it? I think that's
Yeah, absence of external coercion, I think, is the
okay.
true definition, but the way you phrase it applies applicably as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know if we're ever gonna be absent from that coercion as far as be influenced and be tempted to say yes to things and feel pressured but that's the one of the biggest things to get over as an entrepreneur is the ability to say no. And practicing that. So I honestly personally like that second definition when it comes to not necessarily never feeling coerced, but yet not always having to say yes to something, being fully free. And you also brought up a good point. I wonder if the birthmark of an entrepreneur, like when you really break through, is when you turn down a client.
Man, that's an interesting thought. Huh.
I just think if you've gotten to that point where you're able to be more selective to choose who you work with instead of like anybody, please hire me. I think you've gotten to a point in self confidence that's likely derived from now having enough income and enough clients that you actually want to work with that you can turn somebody now. Like I think that's a freeing moment.
Yeah, I would say last year. So this is my third year in business, but last year during my second year of business, I had actually fired a few of my clients, and it was
Wow.
scary, right? Because if you've never done it before, you're like, what am I going to do? But the day after was the biggest sense of relief.
Hmm.
So I never thought of it that way as a milestone of whether or not you're making it or you're arriving, but that's an interesting frame. And I think it goes without saying. I hope everyone get to the point where if they have a client that just doesn't fit, it's not working out, they can say no.
So you were more relieved than you were frightened about losing them.
I think it's It goes back to the aphorism of if a bird lands on a branch, is it because, and then the branch, like, is the bird confident because they're sitting on a branch, or is the bird confident in their own wings?
Mm.
So I just had more confidence that life would be better if I just dipped out of this branch, this client in so far, that I would figure it out, than I was scared to leave. So that's a really interesting line of thought, though. It sounds like you've had a similar experience too when you've made some career pivots. So what was that like? Some of these jumps that you've done between, maybe one was working in the radio station in house and starting your own thing, or something else.
Well, working full time in radio, yeah, that was an option to continue doing that, and potentially even moving cities to try and work my way up to a bigger market. And and everybody wants to end up in New York City, right? Which
Hmm.
wasn't ever really a goal of mine, but again, I was told by outside people that it should be my goal, right? Because that's just how it works, right? You climb the ladder until you get to the top. Well, then I started realizing some of the changes that were made. I did an entire project in college about a company called iHeart
Hmm.
Radio, the biggest radio company, who had gone through some like ridiculous rounds of layoffs, like over 2,000 people who had been at the stations for years, decades in some cases, were well-known personalities, and they let them go in the name of automation and in the name of using AI to try and mimic a real person on the air, and that's now happening at stations across the country. And I think it's totally fascinating, but I also thought it was kind of terrifying to go down that path, even though I didn't work for iHeartMedia. Those layoffs were starting to
Wow.
hit other companies too. So I was like, what's sustainable? Staying in FM radio? Like, who listens to radio anymore? I started asking around. I'm like, wow, I'm the only weird one who actually listens to radio. And that's because I'm on the radio. So I like to hear myself, right? And
Hmm.
so then I started realizing how big podcasts were and how much of a opportunity there was in that space, how much of an opportunity there was in the audiobook space, and started learning about how freeing it could be to have your own business, and how freeing it could be to not be worried about getting laid off every day. I think too many people live in that fear daily. And I decided, hey, what the heck? Why not break free? And I always have a backup plan. I can always go back and fall back on radio if I need to.
Yeah, I think it's a freeing thing to have the option to always go back to your corporate job.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something that was very interesting with the opportunity in audiobook space. I've never correlated podcasting with audiobooks, but I'll tell you what, 3 or 4 out of 5 entrepreneurs I talk to that are big into professional development and continuing education, that consume tons of books, most of them, honestly, over half that I talk to listen to audiobooks exclusively.
Mm. Yeah.
So is that sort of something that you've either delved into or you plan to, which is like narrating audiobooks, or how does that whole industry work? I'm really curious.
Yeah, I started by narrating audiobooks. And I've just completed my 13th. So I've
Wow.
narrated a fair amount of books over the course of my career and my business, and that's been a blast. I mean, that's been one of the most fun pieces of my business, is doing audiobooks for authors. Then I also realized, well, I could be the voice behind it, I could be the narrator, but all these other radio people who are getting laid off are also trying to get into things like audiobook narrating, and that's natural. It makes sense. So what I ended up doing was trying to distinguish myself by just diving into and researching what it takes to produce an audiobook, not just narrate it, produce it, distribute it to all the different audiobook platforms, and actually help authors make a profit off of their books, and either share those profits or get paid up front, or whatever the arrangement is. But it ends up being a win-win for authors. Instead of being the guy who just raises their hand and says, I'll narrate your audiobook, now I've opened myself up to authors who want to narrate their own audiobook, and coaching them through that process, and then taking that audio so they don't have to learn all the ins and outs, the technical stuff about audio and all the requirements to make sure the audiobook is up to standards. I take that audio and I make sure that it's polished and ready for distribution. Then I actually distribute it on their behalf. So that's been kind of the
Hmm.
differentiator that I've done, like to make myself more than just that voiceover guy who can talk for a living, because a lot of us can do that, to somebody who actually can do the whole process, make life easier.
So yeah, you do the production, you do sort of coaching, and also publishing. I don't know if publishing is the right term, but kind of.
Yeah,
You
yeah,
need a book publisher to create it and distribute it, and you do that for audio too. That's cool.
right,
Hmm.
right. That's Audible's a big thing now. As you said, like so many people have Audible subscriptions and audiobooks. That industry just continues to boom over the past few years.
Look, I can't tell you how many people I know that have a commute that's 45 minutes, 60 minutes, and they don't, some to answer your question before, who listens to the radio? I'll tell you, when a previous career, had as a warehouse staff, there were three radios throughout the 30,000 square foot warehouse that were blasting FM radio,
Wow.
and they loved it. Like that's like where they got the news, that's where they got the entertainment. Like that's like whistle while you work. Like that's what they did. But people that I talked to that commute far distance, they were listening to podcast or audiobook, like almost exclusively. Interesting stuff. So
Yeah. Hmm.
at the end of the day, like what are some of the goals that you have for your business and your career that when you get to the point where you feel like you made it, or you feel like, hey, if retirement was on the table, it wouldn't be that bad of a plan. Like how would you like to not end your career, but where would you like your career to go? What are some of your goals?
Man, I'd love to. I was just talking about this with my wife the other day, because we really want to travel, and we have family across over the in different areas in the country, and we'd love to just see other areas of the country. And what I would love to do, because I don't think I'm ever going to want to fully retire from what I do. I love it too much, right? Like that's kind of the entrepreneur mindset, and I'm grateful that I have found something I'm so passionate about. But I want to end up traveling and working, and being able to do that at the same time, and being flexible enough where I actually don't have to be here in my home corner office in Rochester, New York, right? Where I can actually be out on the road doing things. And I got to taste a little bit of that. We went away for a few weeks last summer and visited some family, and it was a great time, and got to work remotely and realize some of the beauty and the benefits of that. But my goal moving forward is to put processes in place, and be able to not just sit back and watch the money roll in. No, that's never what I want to do. I want to be active. I want to be working. I love the grind. I really, enjoy that, but I just want to be able to do that while enjoying life and seeing the beautiful world that I believe God has created for us to enjoy. So that's just my professional goal, kind of mixed with a personal goal, because so many people talk about work life balance, right? And I don't know if life is long enough to just donate 40, 50 or more hours a week to your job, and then just kind of take the leftovers on the weekends or for 2 weeks a year and call it life. I want to integrate work and life to the point where I enjoy my work a lot, and it becomes a big part of my life, but it doesn't interfere with other things that I want to do in life.
Couldn't agree more that when you phrase work versus life as a balance on two sides of a different scale, it's just like you're just doing life, and work should be a big part of it. That's what people were
Right.
meant to do. I think, to reference the Bible, God gave Adam a job before he gave him a wife.
True. You're right.
So,
Yeah.
um, to separate your work from your life, I think it's such a noble goal to integrate your work and your life so that you can continue to work until you're done living,
Hmm.
whatever
Yeah.
that looks like. That's awesome. Well, John, we're approaching the end of our time together. Can you do me a favor and share with the audience how they can get a hold of you and get in touch if they need your services or want to connect?
Of course, yeah. So my full name is Jonathan, and really only my mom and telemarketers call me Jonathan, but that's okay. That's actually my website too. It's JONATHAN, Jonathan, and then my last name, Goehring, GOEHRING.com. So you can find my website there. I do have a newsletter. The form pops up when you go to the website if you're interested in staying connected. And what I do through that newsletter is really try to give some monthly value to the people who subscribe. I really, I summarize some of the blog content that I put together up on LinkedIn there, just so you can learn more about audio, improving your sound. I think that's really an underrated and underutilized tool that we have is audio. So again, jonathangoehring.com is the website. And also on LinkedIn is where I'm very active. It's John Goehring, JONGOEHRING. Very active on LinkedIn, and that would be definitely the spot that if you want to reach out and start a conversation, feel free to message me there.
Awesome. Everyone listening, thanks so much for tuning in. I don't run ads in the show, don't plan to. The only way the show grows is by sharing it. So my only ask is to share the show. Until next time, thanks so much, John. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Ross.